I would like to begin this morning by sharing with you a rather strange event that occurred in my life this week. And I share it because it'll make sense as the story goes. So Mondays, I come to the office, and one of the first things that I do is I begin to plan and organize the worship service for the next week. So one of the very first things that I do is make a copy of the previous week's bulletin and change the responsive reading and text someone to read the text for the week, and then to put the announcements in, change the orders and things like that that need to be done. All that administrative work that goes into building that piece of paper that you have in your hand. And one of the things I do then as a part of that is to pick hymns and to decide on a title for the sermon. Now, normally the title's pretty easy because if you've noticed my pattern over the years, I have a tendency to preach part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So typically it's just, part X of whatever is coming, right? Part N plus 1, whatever that might be. Well, this particular week, I didn't have that because I'm starting a new pericope as we move now into 1 Corinthians chapter 1, starting in verse 18. I didn't have a title. And so my first reaction typically is to look into the Bible and see the title that's printed there. You will, in my particular version, ESV that I'm using, the Pew Bible that I'm using, has a title over verse 18, Christ, the wisdom and power of God. And so I thought, oh, that sounds like a great title for the section. So I put that in the bulletin. And then I went and picked some hymns. And so I did what I typically do, which is I look at the hymns based on when we've last sung them and try to pick hymns that we haven't sung in a while because, I don't want it to be too repetitious in what we do. We have a very limited repertoire to begin with, but I try to pick some that's been some time since we've done that. At this particular point, Monday, I typically don't know what the theme of the sermon's going to be. I haven't spent a lot of time in it. I have kind of an idea, but I'm not really sure, especially when I cross from one pericope to the next like I'm doing here. I don't really have a solid sense in where I'm going to go. So I picked some hymns and I sent it to Lori and Wayne, and then I got on to the business of producing a sermon. And I wrestled. I wrestled because, to be honest with you, trying to get from 17 to 18 is difficult in this text, especially because I was too influenced by the fact that whoever printed this Bible put a break between 17 and 18. And I was way too influenced by that. I thought that that was the natural breaking point. And then so as I began to really think about this text, 17 and 18 and so forth, I began to realize, oh, wait a minute, wait. 17 is an important verse, and it flows naturally into 18. The break is artificial here. So as I began to think through this flow from 17 down into 18 and so forth, I began to realize that that title that's in that section is wrong. Not the right title. It's not the title I want to use. And so I began to work through what verse 18 and following is about, and the Lord began bringing some ideas to my mind about what to say about verse 18. And I realized, no, a much better title for this sermon would be The Power of the Cross. And so about midweek, about Wednesday, I said, okay, that's going to be my title. And then I thought to myself, man, wouldn't it have been great if I had picked The Power of the Cross to sing this week? So I pulled up my bulletin to change the title and discovered that that's precisely the hymn that I had picked. Now, trust me when I say this. I did not do that on purpose. As I said, I didn't know what I was actually going to be preaching on this morning. Now, some would say, well, it was in the back of your mind, you subconsciously picked it, and that sort of thing. I'd prefer to give that to the Spirit of God who put that particular song there. So we sang The Power of the Cross this morning entirely by accident, from my perspective, but not from the perspective of the Spirit of God. Now, having said that, let's take a look at where we are at. Now, let me just review where we are so we get a running start, all right? We've been looking at the last few Sundays at the appeal that the apostle makes in this letter. He's writing to the church at Corinth, and he makes an appeal. Remember verse 10, I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree that there be no divisions among you. And you remember that this is a second letter that Paul has written. Okay, this is actually 2 Corinthians, because according to chapter 5 and verse 9, there was a letter prior to this that the apostle had sent. Now, I remind you that that particular letter has been lost in history. We don't have it. Okay, it wasn't protected by the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God and the church did not see fit to preserve it, but this particular letter was preserved and saved. And I would suggest to you that part of the reason that this one is preserved and the first one is not is because of the passage we're going to look at right here. This passage becomes, if you will, a theological treatise that anybody in the first century reading would go, that's Scripture. Now, they weren't thinking that directly, but they thought, this is important, this is extraordinary, and the Spirit of God preserved it through them by doing so. So, Paul makes his opening appeal after his greeting, and he appeals for the church to be unified, all right? Unified. To agree, to have no divisions, to be united, both in heart and in mind, in judgment. Because, as we saw in verses 11 and 12, they have divided themselves under certain, what I call speculative or imaginary heads, quote unquote. They have this idea of things that they want to align themselves under. They have purposely, as I said last week, they have purposely defied a unity in the church by aligning themselves with various personalities. They've chosen to do that. I call it a defiance, not because this was accidental, but it was very much they did. They have eroded the singularity of the church. They have unified, quote unquote, under things inconsistent with the person and work and mission of Christ, which I'll come back to in a minute. And Paul explicitly rejects such alignments, as you see in verses 13 to 16, by noting, first, the singularity, what I called last week, the simplicity of Christ and his gospel. I'm going to come back to that this morning. And the limited nature of his own ministry in Corinth. He said, look, if you're aligning under me, that's kind of foolish. I only baptized 3 people. So he's rejecting these alignments. He's saying these things are foolish, and he's condemning them. So as I was approaching this text, I thought, that's worthy of a bit more discussion. A bit more discussion. Because I really didn't get into this too terribly much last week. I should have. Didn't have time, as it turns out. Again, the Lord knows. So I would like to consider with you some other things, let's put that in quotes, some other things that churches find themselves uniting around. And as I speak of these things, you will find some familiarity in some of them. Some of them may stoke some memories, not necessarily good ones. What kinds of things does the church find itself uniting around? What is the center of the church, of our church, of a particular church, right? Wherever we are, whatever church we might want to be. Now, Paul has already given us one example, and that is aligning ourselves with various personalities, various people who seem to be, at the top. It's very much like the church that says, well, you should hear our pastor, or, our pastor's a well-known guy. He goes throughout the whole world. He writes books. He's a well-known guy. In the church, the people of the church find themselves at times centering around him. It's all about him. It's about his ministry, his celebrity nature, if you will. You should come to our church because, man, our pastor, right? So Paul has already given us one example. Let me suggest there's a few more. There are some churches that center themselves around various power brokers. Now that's, again, similar to what we talked about last week. But those who would say that, well, our church is centered around this man. See, our church is around this man. See, he's the guy that's in charge around here. When you come to our church, you know that this man is in charge, you see. And he has his lieutenant and his followers below that. So they very often you'll see churches that will say, yeah, we're all about him, or we're all about them as a group. Treating the head and followers as the driving force of the church. So Paul's already mentioned those, but how about those churches that unite themselves around their programs? Well, look at all the things that we do. I mean, we have all these in-reach and outreach programs in the church. You know, we have a food pantry, and we have a senior citizen group, and we've got AA meetings and CC meetings and BB or whatever the other letters you want to use. And we've got all of these things going on. We've got scouting troops, and we have all these programs. You come to our church, we've got a program for you. You're a divorced man? We got a divorced man's group. Come to our church. And they focus themselves around those programs. We're identified by those things that we're doing. Now, I'm not saying any of those things are bad. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying those things are bad. Many of them are good. Some of them not so much. But the church has a tendency, does it not, to become identified by those things that it's doing. Come to a membership class in a lot of churches, and what if they have one? What they'll really talk about most of the time is, well, here's the things we do as a church. Here's our programs, and you can get plugged in, is the word. You can get plugged in some place. So the church winds up spinning around these things that it's doing. Or how about churches that find their center around their productions? Their productions, the various ways that the church caters, if you will, to the felt needs of his people, right? You should come to our church. Man, our worship is like nothing you've ever seen. I mean, we have the best musicians. We have the best instrumentations. We have got, you know, our smoke machine's on back order, but it's coming. I mean, we've got the productions, or, you know, we do the Christmas we do the Christmas production like nobody else in this community. Or we're well known for our Easter production. I mean, we even have Jesus, you know, on a cross and, you know, literally rising out of the church. You should come and see that. Our productions. How many churches find themselves circling those kinds of things? We are identified. Our center is these productions that we do. Or how about the church that focuses its attention or finds its center around its prestige? Around its prestige. You know, we're an important church in this community. We've been around for 150 years. We are at the very heart of this church. You know, we don't call ourselves First Church for no reason. You know, when we're part of this community, we're the very essence of what this community is all about. We have a lengthy heritage here. And we find ourselves wanting you to come because we're important. We have a prestige. See, all those sound familiar, don't they? Some of you are going, yeah, I've been in churches like that. I know what you're talking about. Where the church is focused on its personalities, or its power brokers, or its programs, or its productions, or its prestige. Notice I've named them all with a P. But there's one additional one that we need to be careful of, and that's those who center their church around their positions. Their positions. You know, as in Reformed circles, right? We have a stance here. We have a certain position that we take. We are unique around this or this, right? We rally around these things and they identify us, you see. We're Reformed, or we're Calvinistic, or we're a church that has, you know, an open mind to different things, you see. We take a stance. We have a position. And a position on everything. Name it, we have a position. We take a position on it, you see. And so there's a danger of that as well, of a church being identified by the kinds of positions that it takes in the world. Now, again, don't hear me as saying that these are inherently evil. Okay, some of them can be, but in themselves they're not inherently evil, but they become problematic when they become the focus of the church, when they become the center, when they become the reason the church exists. We're here because we're Reformed. We have a tendency to want to say that, don't we? We need to be very careful because Paul would condemn that as well. Paul would condemn any center of the church that's not Christ. No matter how good it might be. Those programs in the church might be great. Those productions might be wonderful. Those power brokers might have the best motives. And the prestige of the church is certainly real. But that, when it becomes the center of the church, when it becomes the focus of the church, when it becomes the reason the church exists, then it becomes a problem. And that's what Paul is dealing with. So that leads us to the question I left you with at the end of our time last week. What is our true unifying center? What is to be the center? If it's not our power, if it's not our prestige, if it's not our productions or programs, what is it? What is the foundation of the unity of the church? What is it that undergirds the church and gives it its purpose, its reason for existing? And this is what Paul will transition into. And I would have you to note that Paul is going to contrast his message with their thinking. That's what he's going to do. He's going to contrast his message with their thinking as we move our way through the verses starting in verse 18. Now, as I said at the opening, I really only touched on verse 17 last week. 17 deserves more attention. It's actually part of this pericope. In fact, I went back and updated all the bulletins and all the outlines that I had printed from last week and cut the sermon off at verse 16. So if you go back and look, you will notice all the outlines have been changed from verse 17 to verse 16 because I just gave lip service to 17. So we're really going to start in 17. As I said, I was way too influenced by this artificial break that's in my text. 17 is where we need to go. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of his power. Here's what Paul does in this verse. He contends a few things about his purpose and work, and he's making this contention in contrast to the current situation at Corinth. Here's what I'm saying to you. Here's what I'm contending. And there are several things that he contends. First, Christ did not send me to Corinth to baptize. Okay? Let me just state that very clearly to you, Paul says. I didn't come to town to baptize. Paul dismisses any notion that the church was established by him as some sort of ritualistic center, like the surrounding temples. Okay? I want you to notice that. Corinth, as I said in my introduction sermon on this series, was a deeply pluralistic, pantheistic city. There were dozens of temples and a massive amount of ritualistic practices in those temples every day. You can go to Corinth today, go down to the Peloponnese Peninsula, and you can go there and you can walk around in Corinth and you will see dozens of ruins of ancient temples. I have one on the front page of my website. I took a picture of while I was there, the temple to Apollos, not the Apollos of the Bible. There were temples all over the place. This town was full of religion. It was full of mystical practices. It was loaded with these things. And Paul is dismissing the idea that he came to town to start a new cult. He didn't come to town to do that. He didn't come to town in order to baptize people in some sort of ritualistic sense in order to create a new temple worship in that place. And let me just remind you of something, and I apologize for the young ears in the room, but these temples also included prostitution. Sexual immorality was rampant in the city of Corinth, and it started in the temples where they had what you might call spiritualized prostitution in those places. See, what Paul's driving at here is this. Human beings will worship something. They will. They will worship something. We have been created by our Creator and endowed by our Creator with a nature to honor someone greater than ourselves. Paul states it explicitly in Romans 1, 22 and 23. The problem is, in rejecting our Creator, we find ourselves bowing down to anything and everything. Human beings have this need to worship, and they know it. And so they'll build every imaginable kind of religion, every kind of temple imaginable, every kind of ritualistic system, even to the perversion of sexuality itself, in order to worship, because they have a drive for it. But Paul here is pointing away from that in his mission. Paul's pointing away from that. He said, I didn't come to town to baptize people to become some important person of status in doing so. I didn't come to town in order to establish some sort of cult religion based on burying people in water. Didn't come to do that. Now, let me just note for you, in case you're confused here, that this isn't Paul saying that he didn't think baptism was important. Of course he thought baptism was important. It's an ordinance of the Lord himself, even as he himself writes in Romans 6:4, as the symbolism of being buried in water is symbolic of being buried in Christ. So he's not in any way dismissing baptism here. He uses this as an example of a ritual being abused, which is what we do. We take that which is good, and over time we slowly pervert it into something it's not originally intended to be. And so Paul says, look, I didn't come to town to baptize you people. I didn't come to town to establish some sort of baptism cult. I didn't come to town to establish a church of baptism. No, I came for something else. I came to preach the gospel. I came to preach the gospel. Christ didn't send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. His true mission, Paul says, is to do what Christ sent him to do, and that is to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. That word gospel is a word which means good news. I came to preach good news into a place of deep debauchery. That's what I did. I came to preach good news into a place of deep debauchery. This three-word phrase, preach the gospel, is just one word in the Greek. It's the word you're all familiar with. It is to evangelize. That's the word. Evangelizo in the Greek, simply to evangelize. The word means to announce. It means to proclaim the good news. And again, it's over against the wickedness in the city of Corinth. Paul was sent by Christ to a wicked place like Corinth to announce a message of good news. A message of salvation. A message from Christ Jesus the Lord. He, Paul says, sent me, Paul, to this place to preach this gospel. That was my mission. That is what I'm coming to do. I mean, the word apostle itself means messenger. He was a messenger. Ain't my message. It's his. I've just come to tell you the message. Now, there's an extraordinary paradox here. And you probably have already noticed it. Maybe not been able to articulate it, but you've noticed it. This message is, ironically, yet obviously, not good news to rebels. It's good news, but it's not good news to rebels. The gospel certainly is good news to some, but it is awful news to others. Because not only is the gospel a message of salvation, the gospel is also a message of condemnation. It is also a message that God is holy and his law will be done and his justice must come. So the paradox here in this is I've come to preach the gospel. As Paul is saying, I didn't come to baptize people or create some sort of baptism cult in the city over against all this debauchery. I came to preach a message of good news, which, by the way, to many of them is actually awful news. Now, I want you to keep that thought in mind. We're going to come back to it. Nonetheless, Paul was sent into this place to preach the gospel, and he knew what he was up against when he came. And he says, and I didn't come with words of eloquent wisdom. Again, he says, I didn't come to become someone, quote unquote, by virtue of my eloquence or my charisma or my charm or my intelligence or my handsomeness or whatever other things you want to insert in there. I didn't come with eloquence with this. Eloquent wisdom, by the way, is the word Sophia. We get our word wisdom from it. It's very simple. In the King James, it's translated as wisdom of words. Good translation. It simply means specialized knowledge, skill in handling speech or content, or having extraordinary insight, to be able to see and speak of what others don't necessarily see. So what Paul is saying is, I didn't come to town so that I could speak with this kind of eloquence that would focus your attention on me rather than on the gospel, on my message. Now, again, Paul's not saying here that eloquence is necessarily bad, right? You should not bore your people to death so that they're not listening to you at all. There should be some eloquence and charisma in what you're saying. But the eloquence of the speaker causing the audience to miss the point of the message is bad. And I would suggest to you that too many men who think they're eloquent and charismatic when they preach wind up distracting their people from the message to the messenger. Oh, is he such a wonderful preacher? I mean, I could sit and just listen to him for weeks. What's he preach about? I have no idea, but he is just the most eloquent preacher that I've ever heard. I mean, he just lifts me up on gossamer wings to heights of... See, and none of you say that about me, right? And so, I hope not. I was being serious. Because that's what Paul is saying here. I'm not coming to town to be eloquent. I'm not coming to town to preach a message to you with words of eloquence that would focus your attention on me. I came to preach the gospel. My message was to be on it. In this case, Paul says, I didn't come to town to become someone important by virtue of being a great speaker, diminishing the message of Christ by calling attention to myself, as though I'm important. See, I think this is a problem that Paul was having with Apollos, because apparently he was an eloquent, charismatic speaker, and this was causing even some division in the church. He says, I didn't come to baptize. I came to preach the gospel. I didn't come with words of eloquent wisdom. And here's where he pulls the trigger. Lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. That is the point. I didn't come preaching in such a way that my eloquence would distract from the message. I came to preach a message of the power of the cross of Christ. In all those possibilities that I gave you earlier of the things the church centers on, right? It's power brokers, it's prestige, it's programs, it's etc. The fact of the matter is that the message of Christ becomes diminished in those places. Becomes diminished. It becomes diminished both in its efficacy to save and in its centrality in the life of the believer and the mission of the church. Christ is no longer in those kinds of churches that find themselves focusing on those human-centered things, that the message of Christ to save is diminished, and the centrality of Christ in the life of the believer and in the life of the church is diminished. That's the danger of all those things. All those things may be fine in and of themselves. It's great to have prestige. But if prestige becomes the primary thing around which the church is focused, then the message of Christ is diminished. Why are we here? Why are we here? We have this grand church. First church of so-and-so. Aren't we special? We've been here for 150 years preaching in this place. We haven't saved a soul in the last 70, but hey, here we are. This phrase then, as I said, becomes the theme of the verses to follow. I didn't come to preach with eloquence. I didn't come to baptize. I came to preach the simple gospel of Jesus so that the power of the cross of Christ is not emptied. So Paul contends those four things in that verse. But let me also point out that he intimates some things. There's some things you can intimate out of the text. Okay, so let's step back from the text and let's look at a higher level some of the things that he intimates. And he intimates a few things against their unity. As I said, he's going to make some contentions against their situation. So let me tell you some things he says about them by implication, by intimation from verse 17. First, this is not by intimation, but it's clearly obvious that the gospel of Jesus Christ is the unifying center of the church. That's intimated in this verse. Paul says, I came to preach the gospel, and not with eloquence or, some sort of fantastic charisma, but I came to preach this gospel to you, and thus it becomes the unifying center of the church. If what he came to preach was from Christ himself, then it is reasonable to conclude the church formed from it should be centered around it. Right? Right? If Christ sent Paul to the church to preach the gospel, and the church was formed by his preaching, then by obvious implication, that becomes the center of the church. It's the whole reason for its existence. Why are we here? Well, Paul didn't come to create a baptism center. Paul came to preach the gospel. And we believe that gospel and are joined together as a church. So what's our center to be? Well, what made us? This is why it is dangerous to center your church around things like productions. Because there's an old adage that says what you get them in with is what you got to keep them with. And if you bring them in with your productions, you're going to have to keep advancing your productions to get them in. But let me suggest to you that if you bring them in with the gospel, you keep them with the gospel because it becomes their center, you see? So the first intimation, obvious, is that the gospel is the center, the unifying center of the church. But the second intimation, which cannot be denied from verse 17, is that they, the Corinthians, have lost that unifying center. Is that not the intimation of the verse? They have lost that unifying center in focusing upon themselves. Even as he, prior to verse 17, lists those various divisions, he says, I've heard from Chloe's people that this is what's happening. He condemns their factions before making this statement. Thus, it is reasonable to conclude that they have lost this as the center of their unity. I didn't come to town to baptize. I came to preach the gospel. Why do I have to say that to you? Because you are no longer centered around that gospel, you see. That's a clear intimation from this verse. And the third, building upon those two, the gospel of Christ is the unifying center. They have lost that unifying center. The third intimation from the verse is that the church, the Corinthian church, has lost its power against the world of wickedness surrounding them. They have lost their power against the wickedness surrounding them. Since the message of the gospel, which was Paul's primary message, which we already asserted they have lost, they're no longer centering on, being focused on other things. Since it's no longer the center of the church, it is reasonable to conclude that they have no power to either address or withstand the power of evil surrounding them. I'll give you the example that I gave you earlier. The issue of sexual immorality coming out of those temples, invading the church, was the key issue of the first letter, the one that's been lost. We know that as you read chapter 5, verse 9. Paul had written a letter to them about the fact that they were engaging in various kinds of sexual immoralities that were coming out of the church, out of the temples all around them. That letter's been lost. I think the Lord took it out because Paul didn't properly address the issue. This addresses the issue. So Paul writes here now, let me tell you what the issue really is. Let me tell you how we're going to address this. So the issue of sexual immorality coming into the church, invading the church, being the key issue of that first letter, will crop up again later in this letter to prove this point. You're going to see it again as we move into this letter. But instead of directly addressing it as Paul did in letter 1, here he's going to first lay the foundation, which is the passage we're going to look at here, which will then address what is about to come, you see. He's going to use a different approach here, the right approach, the approach the Spirit wanted him to use. So the church has lost its power against the world of wickedness surrounding them. Look, if I might be so bold, I would say that's exactly the reason why the modern church is utterly impotent against the sexual revolution taking place out there. Because we, as the so-called church, have lost our center in the gospel. Now, let me make a clarification right about here. I'm going to use a couple of phrases interchangeably. The first is, Christ is the center of the church, okay? But I'm also going to use the phrase, the gospel is the center of the church. Now, I tell you, my friends, those two things are synonymous. When I say Christ is the center of the church, or the gospel is the center of the church, I'm meaning the same thing. Let me go back to what I was talking about last week. I was talking about the simplicity of God. I imagine some of you might have considered that. Of course, most of you ignored it. But think about the simplicity of God. He is one, not parts, one, a singular whole, a singular sense that all of his nature, his purpose, his decree, his work, his vision, his mission, his methodology, his providence, etc., all are one. God is one. In fact, I even forgot to put this in the outline. I thought of it during the course of the week, and that's even ensconced in the Shema. The Lord, our God, the Lord is one. The idea being that God is not the sum of a bunch of different parts. He is a whole, unified, simple, for lack of a better word, the only word we can find in English to describe him. He is simple in that he's not broken up into pieces. Now, it's true that as creatures, we have to separate all these things out in order to understand it, right? We have to take one aspect of God and examine it against other aspects of God. But such separation should never pit one aspect of God's nature or work against another. We don't have a right to go, well, look, we only focus here on the love of God. We don't ever talk about his wrath. Or we only focus here upon God's mercy. We never talk about his justice, etc. See, that's pitting God against God. Mistaking that we can split God into parts and then focus on just the parts we like. No, God is a singular whole. His love and his wrath are a part of his nature. His justice and his mercy are part of his nature, and on and on and on. And we carry that down then to Christ himself. As I pointed out last week, the simplicity of Christ is such that there is no separation or distinction between him and his gospel. There's no distinction between him and his message. They're one and the same. They're the same thing. There is no gospel without Christ. There is no Christ without his gospel. Those two things go hand in hand. He is the message, and his message is he, if you will. We don't separate it. Well, we have a Jesus over here, but we've decided not to preach the fullness of his gospel because, well, there's some parts of that that are kind of offensive, right? We talk about sin and judgment and hell. We don't talk about those things. We want to talk about Jesus, but we don't want to talk about those things. Well, that's doing precisely the same thing. It's splitting up Jesus into parts and picking out the parts we want. No, Christ is one and a whole. In fact, it's probably the best part of the discussion when we talk about the nature of Jesus himself as the God-man. Where does the God end and the man begin? I don't know, because it's a singular. Now, yes, we agree in the confessions that those two natures are distinct from one another and do not in any way suppress or whatever you want to call it, one another. But when we think of Jesus, we think of the God-man, a singular entity. In fact, you do it yourself all the time when you think about yourself. You don't think of yourself in parts. You don't think of yourself in parts. You think of yourself as a whole, don't you? W-H-O-L-E, whole. You think of yourself as a whole, a singular unit. I don't walk around and go, well, this is my arm, and sometimes it does, some things. And we might want to say, well, my arm did this, and I didn't really want it to do that. And I look at you and go, mm-hmm, yeah, you did want it to do that. The same is true when it comes to Christ and his gospel. When we say that Christ is the center of the church and we say the gospel is the center of the church, what we mean is that Christ, who is the gospel who is Christ, is at the center of the church. Those two things are inseparable. But let me extend it one more for you. The simplicity of the church is such that there is no separation or distinction between Christ, his gospel, and his church. As we studied in Colossians chapter 1, verse 18, it is his body. And again, you don't think of a body as a bunch of parts, do you? You think of a body as one. One. That is a body, it's one. We must remember that the church is simple in that sense, that there is no distinction, really, between Jesus and his gospel and his church. They are all one in the vision of Christ himself. Now, again, we have a tendency to separate these, right? We have a tendency to see the church as an institution somehow separated from its message, the church as an institution rather than as an organism. But just as no single cell in your body operates entirely by itself with no purpose in the larger group, the separation of the church in that matter is utterly wrong as well. In fact, the separation that caused all the errors that I mentioned earlier, programs, procedures, et cetera, I didn't use the word procedures, I used productions. There's a P letter, I should have used that. They're missing the central thing of the church and wrongly substituting other centers as well. They're substituting something for Christ. They're substituting something for his gospel. They're substituting something else for the church itself, because those things are all one in the mind of God. So what we see in verse 17 is Paul intimating that the divisions of the Corinthian church, which all stem from their loss of the gospel as their unifying center, implies that they have lost the power of the cross. Because that's what he says at the end. It's emptied. I didn't come to preach so that the gospel is emptied of its power. What's he intimating? That the church has lost the power of the cross. In fact, in the very next phrase, he says, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing." The message of the gospel preached by Paul is foolishness and repulsive to those who stand in rebellion against God. This phrase, word of the cross, is a two-word phrase, logos staro, preaching of the cross in the King James Version. So it's the word of the cross. It's the revelation of the cross. Okay, it's the revelation of the cross. It's the meaning of the cross. It's the message stemming from the cross. All right, the cross. The word of the cross is what? The word of the cross is what it means. The word of the cross is its substance, what it says. Okay, that's word, logos, revelation. Now, not the simplistic fact that Jesus, the man, was crucified. Okay, that's part of it, certainly. There was a man named Jesus, a carpenter from Nazareth, who was crucified, yes. But that's not the primary message of the cross. That's part of the message of the cross, but that's not the message of the cross. Rather, the message of the cross, the word of the cross that Paul's talking about, is what his crucifixion ultimately means to us as individuals and as a church and to everyone else to preach. What does this mean? Again, just as the simplicity of Christ's person and work makes his nature, his message, and his church all one. So the cross is a simplistic message which includes his resurrection. So the cross of Christ is not limited to just the message of the cross itself. It includes also the resurrection. Now, again, Paul doesn't specifically mention the resurrection in this pericope. You won't find it here. It's always in the back of his mind, nonetheless. Hey, think about it. When you think of the cross, must you not also think of the resurrection? It goes with it. As I say on Easter Sunday morning, if Jesus had not been raised from the dead after he was crucified, then none of us would know about his existence. His name would be nothing but a footnote in a dusty book on a library shelf somewhere. That would be all that the world would know of him because, okay, he was crucified, so what? His resurrection is tied directly to the reality of his cross, and Paul knows that. In fact, you have an entire chapter in this book dedicated to that reality, right? Chapter 15, and Paul's going to come to that. A crucifixion has no eternal meaning if one crucified has not been risen from the dead, has not been raised from the dead. If he is not risen, then there's no reason to talk about this crucifixion. This particular crucifixion has great meaning, just as the resurrection as a historical fact must have meaning to those who believe it happened. The whole point of my message is on Easter Sunday morning. But in this case, Paul will focus specifically on the cross. He will focus specifically on the cross. He won't talk about the resurrection yet. He'll do that later. Now, before we can proceed into this verse, we must observe something. Let me make an observation for you with my remaining time this morning. In Western civilization, we have been immersed in Christian-influenced culture for a very long time. Western civilization is probably 1,500 years old, give or take, dating from the fall of the Roman Empire till now. We have been immersed in a Christian-influenced culture for a very long time. And the symbol of the cross has become, to a large extent, very passé to us. This symbol here, a cross. We take it for granted. That's what I mean by passé. We take it for granted. You think about all of those people who would never darken the door of a church on a Sunday morning, would never go near a church, but they're perfectly happy wearing a cross as a piece of jewelry around their neck. Don't have any problem with that at all. It's become a symbol which has largely lost its meaning. And part of the reason is that we have sanitized the cross by virtue of living 2,000 years after its usage. In fact, we've even gone so far as to implement a genuine Christian principle in Western society, which is that of no cruel and unusual punishment. So we've even built our laws around the idea of sanitizing the cross itself. To a person living in Corinth in 53 AD, a cross would have meant something else entirely. You and I have to try to get ourselves into the mindset of a first century Corinthian to understand this. Crucifixion, as I mentioned in the last sermon I did on Malachi, crucifixion was well known throughout the Roman Empire. It was used starting around 500 BC under the Persians. It was later adopted by the Greeks. Alexander the Great crucified a great number of people. And it was highly adapted by the Romans. They were particularly adept at using it. And crucifixion under the Roman Empire was a form of execution designed to extract the greatest amount of physical and emotional anguish, or better word is torture, upon the individual as possible. This was a form of execution that was not designed to be quick, easy, painless, QEP. No. This was a type of execution designed to inflict as much torture as physically possible upon the victim. Victims hung, sometimes for more than a day, on a cross, bleeding, depending on the severity of their pre-crucifixion wounds, slowly suffocating to death while trying to live. Make no mistake about it, human beings have an inbred desire to live. We will fight against death. Even in those moments where we know we're going to die, we will press hard against it. And a victim on a cross, hanging there, nailed to that device, would do everything in his power to try to take one more breath, to try to gasp one more time, to try to keep from dying on that cross. And this would go on, hour after hour, sometimes days in length. The idea was to put them under as much physical torture as was possible to make them pay for their crimes. But not only was it designed to be a physical torture, it was also designed to be an emotional suffering as well. Victims were typically hung there unclothed. I'm convinced that Jesus hung on that cross naked. Shame, the fullness of his physical nature being visible to all who saw him. He was mocked while there. He was beaten. People threw things at him. Insects buzzed around and attacked him, and he had no ability to shoo them away. And as he hung there, hearing the mocking of the crowd, the soldiers would often engage right along with them and egg on the crowd to do so, to make him feel as much emotional anguish and torture as was physically possible during that entire time he's hanging there in the hot sun for days until he finally expires. Emotionally designed to be a torture beyond, frankly, anything we can truly comprehend. You drive into Mississippi now, you will see billboards that say, "We use firing squads here, think twice." Excellent billboards, by the way, in my opinion. But a death by firing squad is quick and relatively painless, but not crucifixion. You were to hang there for days, suffering, bleeding, trying desperately to stay alive, while all the time you're being mocked, people throwing things at you. I wouldn't be surprised at all. The gospel accounts don't tell us this, but I would not be surprised at all if people picked up things from the ground and threw it at him while he was hanging there on that cross. And in the case of Jesus, not only did he have to endure the physical anguish and torture of the event and the emotional anguish and torture of the event, but he also had to hang there experiencing the wrath of God upon him as the Father poured out the fullness of his justice, bearing in himself the guilt and the shame of the sins of the elect as he is separated from his Father. The Romans, as I said, used this particularly as a means of execution to deter crime. Don't get caught, or that's what's going to happen to you. It was an excellent form of deterrence. In other words, to a Corinthian in 53 AD, a crucifixion was an abhorrent means of capital punishment. Those crucified were considered to be the dregs, the worst dregs of society, and were rightly done away with. As a Corinthian, when you heard the word cross, you heard about an instrument designed to get rid of the very worst. They deserved what they got on that cross. When they were crucified, they got what they deserved. They were wicked, they were disgusting, they needed to die. That's how a Corinthian would have seen a cross. So for Paul to come to town with a message centered around a crucified individual would have been unimaginable as good news. Do you understand what I just said? For Paul to preach a gospel of a man being hung on a cross to die this most horrible way. For Paul to come and preach a message of that being good news is unimaginable. You and I take it for granted. We look at that symbol and go, oh yeah, we get it. No. The essence of the gospel, as the Corinthians would have understood it, as we should understand it, is that that was a means of execution designed to kill the worst of the worst. How in the world could the gospel, the wickedness of a cross, become a message of hope and righteousness and salvation? This is why Paul says it's folly to those who are perishing. It makes no sense to them. It makes no sense to them. The irony is that dead men are to look to an instrument of death to find life. Dead men are to look to an instrument of death to find life, and such a message is absolute folly to those whose eyes have not been opened to see it. You see, my friends, when we come to verse 18, well, 17 and 18, when it comes, Paul says he came to preach the gospel, he comes to preach the cross of Christ. He's coming to preach the most counterintuitive message in the history of the world, that an instrument of horrible death becomes the instrument of life. And this is where Paul will start comparing that message with the thinking of the Corinthians and their church.